2. So I'm really happy to welcome Stephen Cheng to speak to us today, who is a person who has an amazing group of credentials, fellow of the Canadian Institute of Actuaries and Society of Actuaries. He's a qualified expert at BC Supreme Court. He's written books and presented to Department of Finance, and we're very lucky to have him here today to talk to us about pensions, benefits, and IPP plans. And so without further ado, I'm going to let Stephen take the floor.
Thank you, Linda. And good morning, everyone. I guess good afternoon in the Eastern time zone. I just came back from Toronto yesterday, so I guess I was escaping from the snow. It snowed a bit Saturday evening as we were leaving. So, okay. Today I'm going to share a little bit of information with you concerning relationship breakdown, certain pension valuation or pension division ideas, methods, and so forth. I guess if you have a question, just feel free to perhaps send it through the chat, and I guess Linda can remind me of these questions. We're dealing with a group of manageable size, so I can take question along the way if it's relevant to the issues being presented. And if I feel that the question may take a little bit longer to answer, I may defer that to the end of the session. We do have a little bit of a question and answer period at the end. Okay. Thank you. And I will share my screen. And after this presentation, I'll share a copy of the slide deck with Linda for distribution to the attendees. But right now, I know pension is a bit complex and technical, but I guess we'll just focus on the general understanding and the knowledge as we go through the slides. Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
No, not yet. Okay. Okay. Yes. Can you see the screen now?
Yep, now we can see it.
Okay, all right. Okay, so I just put it in presentation mode. Is all good? You see the full screen?
Yeah, it looks great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now, okay, here's the agenda we have today. Just a little bit of an introduction. And then we look at the different methods for division of pension assets on relationship breakdown, the key differences in the different methods. And then we will go through some key considerations when picking and choosing a method for settlement of pension. I practice primarily in BC, so I do most of the legal evidence work on the valuation of pension on marriage relationship breakdown in BC and Alberta. But I understand that your membership is across the country, so we may have high level of interest for Ontario registered pension plans, how they administer the pension credit split. I will also share something about individual pension plans, how the pension division is generally being handled. And then towards the end, I will share with you some current developments in the pension division valuation world. And then we'll have a question and answer period. Okay. There are two main methods for settling pension when you have a marriage or relationship breakdown. One is you would go through the pension plan. The pension plan, the way they administer the plan, there's an option for handling pension division on relationship breakdown. Okay. The other option is to do it outside of the pension plan. This is by private agreement between the parties, and in the separation agreement or the court order, the division of the pension issue is spelled out. Okay, so that would usually involve, if it's done outside of the pension plan, the pension plan member giving the non-member spouse what we refer to as a compensation payment. And you, because pension is part of the family property, the member would need to provide the non-member spouse a compensation payment in order to retain their full pension. In BC, under the Family Law Act and Regulation, we refer to that as what we call Part 6 division, because all the rules are spelled out in Part 6 of the Family Law Act and Regulation. And of course, in Ontario, you do have the option of the non-member spouse getting paid what we call family law value from the pension plan as part of the pension settlement. So we'll go through these options later. So for BC, first of all, the key differences between the plan administered credit split in BC and Ontario would be BC, just because of the history, is what we consider a retirement method jurisdiction. Okay, so traditionally we look at the projected benefit, pension benefit at retirement, and say how much is the member entitled to. Okay, whereas Ontario traditionally has been what we call a termination method jurisdiction. You look at how much the pension the member is entitled to, assuming that the terminated employment and membership as of a certain calculation date. So that would lead to quite a bit of difference in the methodology, because when we use retirement methods such as BC, for a pension plan that provides benefits based on what we call final average earnings or best average earnings pension plan. So the pension benefits would be based on the average of the few years of service prior to retirement.
Hi, baby girl. Good girl.
Okay, there's some sound coming through.
I think I've got it. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So for what we call a plan administered credit split in BC, there's certain forms that you need to file with the pension plan administrator. Okay, the one is the spouse would file a form, say I have a claim, right? So that's sort of notifying the plan administrator. You can process, like even if the member terminate membership employment, you cannot pay the member yet. I have a claim. Okay, so that serves that purpose. But then there are also forms that you file, say the spouse and the member reach an agreement. Say, okay, let's do it through the pension plan. Okay, then you file a form. There's a form 2, which is called a application for designation as a limited member. The spouse or former spouse would become a limited member of the pension plan, entitled to a separate entitlement, just like the member, whether it's a lump sum or a separate lifetime pension. Okay, And so this limited member is a definition, a terminology that's used quite often in the BC setting. So if the spouse is a limited member, the spouse can apply for a lump sum commuted value or a separate lifetime pension when the member has reached the earliest retirement age. Okay, in this case here, for most pension plans, the earliest retirement age permissible is age 55. Okay, unless we're dealing with certain what we refer to as public safety occupation, for example, police and firefighters. Okay, and under the Family Law Act and regulation, the spouse's proportionate share of the pension benefits is defined by a formula. Okay, so if you look at the middle of the slide here, the spouse's proportionate share is defined as 50% multiplied by a fraction. It's a ratio A over B. Okay, A is the years of pensionable service accrued during the marriage period or the relationship period. And the B is the total years of pensionable service accrued by the member, whether it's at termination or at retirement. So the spouse's entitlement is defined by this proportionate share. Okay. So after the spouse has become a limited member and entitled to a portion of the benefits, whether it's a lump sum or a separate lifetime pension, if the member terminated prior to attaining the earliest retirement age, the limited member of the former spouse would receive the proportionate share of the member's lump sum or a deferred pension, right? Depending on what the member elected. But the spouse or limited member has his or her own election, whether it's a lump sum or a deferred pension. So graphically, we illustrate how the limited members' proportionate shares determined. Okay, so we look at the sort of the gray area. The total rectangle here represents the total pension, because once the member has joined a pension plan, he or she would accrue benefits from the enrollment dates to the retirement dates or the termination date. Okay, so it's a matter of identifying how much the spouse is entitled to out of this total box, right? And now assuming that the cohabitation date was after the enrollment dates to the pension plan, and then the separation date was prior to the retirement date, we would look at the sort of a narrower corridor here and say that's the portion that's accrued during the relationship period, from dates of cohabitation to dates of separation. So now the spouse or the limited member is entitled to half of that box, right? So that's how proportionate share is defined for the spouse. And they do, the plan administrator, we're talking about the BC public sector plans here. Okay, primarily let's say the municipal pension plan or the public service pension plan, the teachers plan, the college pension plan, and the WorkSafe BC, which is the equivalent of workers' comp. All these plans, they allow flexibility in adjusting the percentage or adjusting these dates here, as long as you provide them with detailed information. So this will also allow the parties to work out an arrangement where the limited member, the former spouse, will get more than 50% of the amount accrued between the dates of cohab and the dates of separation. And this will provide additional flexibility. For example, the parties may be dealing with division of other family properties by one party taking more. Like, for example, having the limited member, for example, the spouse taking the residence, the family residence, which has got substantial value. The pension may also have substantial value, but that will leave the spouse or limited member taking less from the share of pension from the plan, right? So that can be worked out, but it would require the valuation by the actuary to, for example, to assist the parties in determining how much less should, like, what revised dates should be used or what revised percentage should be used if you go through a plan administer split to address the remaining difference in value. So just to understand the concept, when the plan administrator, when they process a lump sum payment on a relationship breakdown, a marriage breakdown, they would pay out what we call a lump sum commuted value. So what is a commuted value? So commuted value is a calculated amount. Okay, so for actuaries, we must follow the Canadian Institute of Actuaries. We have standards of practice for doing pension commuted values. So our job is to determine the present value today. You see the bag of money to the left of the screen. How much money do you need today in order to grow with future investment return or interest? That would be sufficient to pay for the projected pension benefits for the member month by month, year to year, after retirement. Right? So we need to take into account the future growth of the monies. And we also, for example, if the pension benefits are what we call index, like receiving cost of living adjustment each year after commencement, based on the increase in the consumer price index, we will allow for the projected increases. And of course, because the pension is only payable as long as the member lives, or if it's a joint survivor form of pension, both the member and the spouse. So we need to take into account the survival probabilities. Like for each potential future payment, we will look at what's the probability of the member surviving to that point in time and collect that monthly pension payment, right? So it's a matter of taking into account all these considerations in our calculation. It's based on what we call exhausting fund principle. How much of a fund balance you need today, growing with future investment return, that would be sufficient to make all these future pension payments for the pension plan member. And that's what we refer to as the pension commuted value. Now, we have to follow the Canadian Institute of Actuaries standards of practice for doing that. And it's in section 3500. We do look at, like, because the pension plan hasn't, the member hasn't retired as yet, right? So we need, the value would be different commencement ages, right? So we have a member who's, let's say, age 50 currently, and he or she won't be eligible for early retirement from the plan until hitting age 55. But the value may be different if we assume different retirement ages, like for example, 55, 56, 57, and so forth, because every pension plan has different, for example, early retirement reduction. Like compare that to CPP. If you take CPP prior to age 65, the pension amount is reduced, right? If you take it early, it's reduced by 0.6% per month prior to age 65. It's something similar for pension plan, but pension plans may have different early retirement reduction factor as compared to CPP, because from a plan design perspective, the plan may wish to incorporate incentive for early retirement. And that's why you see it's quite common for the public sector type of pension plan to offer early retirement incentives. So the early retirement reduction factor is way less than what CPP is charging you for early commencement. So we look at the different values at different assumed retirement ages. We would look at the age that would trigger the highest value. Okay, and then we look at the pension commuted value at what we call the earliest unreduced retirement age. When would the member be eligible for full pension with no reduction? And our actuarial standards call for taking the two numbers. One at the would trigger the highest, and one determined as of the earliest age. So it's a matter of taking 50 these two values here. That will be the what we call the commuted value. Okay. But for marriage breakdown valuation that we perform to determine how much compensation payment one party should make to the other, it's a transaction not involving the pension plan. Pension plans are mandated by the certain pension legislation in the jurisdiction to use the Canadian Institute of Actuaries standards of practice for pension commuted value. But since compensation payment using other family assets are outside of the pension plan, it's not subject to the use of the commuted value standard. So the Canadian Institute of Actuaries, we have a separate standards for handling this type of calculation, what we refer to as the valuation of the capitalized value of pension plan benefits for relationship breakdown purposes. So this is covered under a separate section. Commuted value is section 3500. The marriage breakdown capitalized value is section 4500. Okay. So I mentioned earlier when we're dealing with different jurisdiction, different rules would apply. BC is traditionally a retirement method jurisdiction. So the future wage increases for best average earnings or final average earnings type of pension plan are included as required by the BC Family Law Act and regulation. Okay, but for Ontario, because traditionally Ontario is what we call a termination method jurisdiction, so future wage increases are not considered in the calculations. Now, for the plan administer split, okay, we would cover the BC setting here. There's a lump sum payment to the limited members locked-in retirement account. Okay, so this is based on the proportionate share. Like we went through that formula, 50% A over B. A is the years of service accrued during the cohab period. B is the total years of pensionable service at retirement or termination. Okay. And but there's a restriction here. The limited member or the former spouse won't be able to access the commuted value until the earliest permissible retirement age under the plan, in this case here, it would be mostly age 55, except for the public safety occupations. So quite often in BC, if you're dealing with couples that are very relatively young, you don't tend to see a whole lot of people choosing to go through the plan because it's a long wait, right? Like imagine you're dealing with a pension plan member who's only 35 years old. The spouse or the limited member would need to wait 20 years in order to access a lump sum pension commuted value from the pension plan. Okay, so I guess that's the reason that when we're dealing with mostly young couples, then the compensation payment outside of the pension plan is usually the settlement option that the parties prefer. The other option is the separate lifetime pension. Okay, so for the public sector plan, the plan administrator would look at the pension commuted value, and on the same actuarial assumptions or basis, they just convert that to a separate lifetime pension for the spouse or a limited member. Okay, mind you that the spouse or limited member, they have total rights to request for a lump sum or separate lifetime pension when the plan member attains age 55. Okay, despite the fact that the member may continue on working beyond age 55, once the member hits age 55, the spouse or limited member is entitled to apply to commence to receive their proportionate share of the commuted value or a separate lifetime pension, irrespective of what the status of the pension plan member will be, whether he or she will continue on working, continue to accrue further benefits, or the plan administrator will do is that by paying out the pension commuted value or starting a separate lifetime pension for the spouse, they would just go to the administration system and take away, if we're just using the standard 50% share for the spouse, remove service credit from half of the credit from those years of cohabitation on the administration system. So when the pension plan member actually retires years later, those years are gone for benefit calculation purposes. So the compensation, when we do the valuation, of course, we need to apply the spouse's proportionate share based on that 50% A over B formula. And of course, we have to use the standards for marriage breakdown. But we do present the results on both a pre-tax and a post-tax basis. Okay, because it depends on the family property use to address the compensation payment. Sometimes they use pre-tax assets, which means they use, for example, RSP funds. But being a limited member since the 1990s, pension plan members would have a pension adjustment reported on the T4 each year, which takes away the RSP deduction limit. So they would have sort of limited RSP deduction room, and they may not have sufficient RSP buildup to provide a compensation payment on a before tax basis using pre-tax assets. So that's why we also present the results on a post-tax basis, because quite often, the compensation payment would come in a after-tax form, using tax pay assets, for example, equity of the family residence. So this is a standard proportionate share. The compensation payment, the capitalized value, the calculation is very similar to the calculation of pension commuted value. We just determine a value that would grow with future investment return. That would be sufficient to make all these future payments to the member. And we are required by the actuarial standards to provide results based on a few assumed scenarios, so that this will give the parties a range of values to consider in reaching a settlement. The four required scenarios based on our standards of practice would be, the first one is that as of the valuation dates or the calculation dates, we would assume the member would terminate employment or terminate membership immediately. Okay. So that would be one scenario. And the other scenarios would include like the assumption of continuing employment, and then retirement and starting pension as of the different ages. So these are the key ages where it would make a substantial difference in how much of a capitalized value the actuaries would come up with in our calculations. One is when the member reach the earliest unreduced retirement age. So quite often, this is the scenario where the capitalized value is the highest, is sort of what we refer to as the optimum retirement age for calculation purposes. And quite often for the BC public sector plan, it would be either age 60 or some combination of age and service. What we refer to, for example, is the 90-point rule. Age plus service equals 90 years. So you may have a plan member at age 55 with 35 years of service. So you add 55 and 35, the member would have satisfied the 90 points rule and qualify for unreduced pension at age 55 instead of age 60. Okay. It depends on the plan. Some plans have an 85-point rule, for example, the public service pension plan. But we would need to identify in our report the capitalized value of pension, assuming continuing employment and retirement as of the earliest unreduced age. Okay. And many pension plans have a maximum number of years of pensionable service permissible. So quite often you see a 35-year maximum on the years of credited service or pensionable service. Okay.
I'm just going to pop in here. There is a question from
Yes.
Lisa in BC. What's the impact to the limited member in BC in standard pension value method if member quits before they reach 55?
Well, if the member quits before age 55, then there's a commuted value option, right? What would happen is that the member will be given a choice, right? Say you have two options, basically. Either you take a lump sum commuted value, or you take a deferred pension starting at age 55 or later, right? So the member will elect an option, but at the same time, the limited member or the spouse will be given also the same option. What would you like for your share? Whether it's a lump sum commuted value based on the proportionate share formula, or a deferred lifetime pension starting at age 55, right? So effectively the limited member has the same right as a member. Entitlement to a pension or a pension commuted value on termination. Bear in mind that the lump sum option is not available to the member after age 55. So if the member worked past age 55, he or she may not be entitled, would not be entitled to the pension commuted value option when he or she later retires. So the commuted value option is only available to the pension plan member prior to the earliest retirement age. But when we have a member termination, it would trigger the same options being available to the limited member, to the former spouse. Okay. So we need to also disclose the scenario when the member has reached the maximum 35 years of credited service or pensionable service. Okay. There's no further accrual after 35 years, but the pension plan will continue to recognize the salary increases after the 35 years maximum has been reached. Okay, so they would continue, the pension plan would continue to recognize the salary increases after the 35 years service maximum. There's no further members' contribution required by the member after reaching 35 years, because the member is not accruing any further years of service. And then the normal retirement age generally is age 65 for most pension plans. So as a minimum, we need to disclose all these scenarios. The actuarial standards are different. The plan administered split use commuted value, but the compensation payment outside of the pension plan is covered under a different section, because the compensation payment is using non-pension plan assets. Okay, the two standards, the common thing is that they use the same mortality assumption, which is the 2014 Canadian Pensioners Mortality Table. That would also include a future improvement in mortality. We've been using the same actuarial, the mortality basis for both commuted value and for marriage breakdown calculation since October 2015. But the economic assumptions that we use to do the calculations are different for the two different standards, because these take into account how pension fund assets are invested as compared to family assets, personal assets, for capitalized value for marriage breakdown calculation purposes. So I summarize here the current sort of economic assumptions that we use for purpose of the calculations. Okay, for what we refer to as non-index pension, like there's no post-retirement cost of living adjustment, the pension amount is fixed. We refer to that as non-index benefits. Under the pension commuted value basis, we use different discount rates for the first 10 years and then after the first 10 years. Okay, so the current discount rates are 4.4% per annum for the first 10 years. And then after 10 years, we move to 4.6%. Okay. These are determined based on the Government of Canada bond yields. So it reflects the sort of the economic value of a pension benefit. Okay. For the relationship breakdown capitalized value calculations, you notice the difference is that rather than having a separate rate for the first 10 years, the rate is for 20 years, the first 20 years and thereafter. So for marriage breakdown capitalized value, the first 20 years, we assume 3.9% per annum. And then after the first 20 years, we move on to an ultimate rate that's 4.75%. Actually, the marriage breakdown, the relationship breakdown actuarial standards were amended effective January 1st, 2023. So we have some recent changes, which I will cover later on in a later slide under recent development. That for what we refer to as 40 CPI index pension. So these are the benefits that would receive full increases in the consumer price index post-retirement. For pension commuted value, the first 10 years, we assume 2.4%. So you notice as compared to the 4.4% for non-index, the spread is about 2% to account for inflation. Okay. Similarly, after the first 10 years, the rate for 40 CPI index pension is 2.6%, the discount rate that we use. So as compared to the non-index 4.6% per annum, there's the 2% spread for inflation. For relationship breakdown, the discount rate is 1.9% for the first 20 years. Again, the spread is about 2% to account for inflation. After the first 20 years, the discount rate is 2.7% as compared to the 4.75% for non-indexed. Okay, so you may ask to say, okay, between the two calculations, which is going to give a higher number or a lower number? So it really depends, right? Because under the BC family rules, we need to incorporate the future wage increase in our calculations for a plan that provides benefits based on what we call final average or best average earnings plan, right? So that tend to give a higher value to the capitalized value. But then you notice for the discount rates, right? The pension commuted value is mandated by the pension regulators, and depending on and we would use the commuted value economic assumptions, which tend to give you lower discount rate, right? So it depends on how these factors interact. Sometimes you may see a higher value under the capitalized value because of the inclusion of future salary increases in BC, and sometimes you see a lower value as compared to the pension commuted value, because pension commuted values tend to use a little bit lower discount rates.
I'm just gonna, before you carry on, we have a couple of questions.
Okay.
And just so everybody knows, yes, Stephen's gonna share the slides so I can send them to you. So for your answer to Lisa as to BC, is that in Ontario too, that it considers salary increases after the contribution ends?
No, Ontario, because traditionally it's under what we call termination method. So the inclusion of future salary is not mandated by by the Family Law Act regulations. If you look at Alberta's, which is kind of a hybrid, it's not like spelled out in the family law legislation, but when we prepare legal reports on pension, like for evidence on pension value, we present both scenarios with and without the inclusion of future salary increases. Right? So it's up to the court, it's common law, right? So
Mhm.
it's up to the court to decide whether the future salary increases would be included.
And then Carl is also asking the previous slide to this with the percentages, for indexing or not, is that also something that's factored in Ontario or not?
Yes or no. The reason is that when we do the calculation for relationship breakdown valuation, we're supposed to take into account, like you notice some pension plans, especially the industry pension plans, right? Let's say carpenters, plumbers, or construction trade. Quite often, the board of trustees would approve what we call ad hoc increases to the pensioners. So they do get periodic, but it's not guaranteed. But if there's a sort of a pattern that we would request from the plan administrator, the cost of living adjustment history, like the ad hoc increases granted by the board of trustees, and take that into account in our valuation, right? So we may say, we look at history, say the history indicate long-term, the trustees would provide increases approximately equal to 50% CPI. So we would take that into consideration in our valuation work. So it's sort of implicitly taken into account as required by our actuarial standards, because there's a certain section that the actuary need to take into account the increases approved by the board of trustees. Right.
Great, thank you.
Okay, welcome. So now there's some key considerations whether they should, when they do the lump sum, whether they should go through the plan or they should go through a compensation payment setting using other family assets. Timing is one consideration, because the plan administer split, even if the spouse filed a form P1 or P2 becoming a limited member, the limited member is not able to request for a commuted value payout or separate lifetime pension until the member has reached earliest retirement age, right? So timing or age is a key consideration, but the compensation payment, as long as the parties can reach a settlement or there's a court order, then it's settled right away. It's a immediate settlement, okay? Another consideration is that if it's done through the pension plan, the spouse received a transfer from the pension plan, the funds are locked in. It's supposed to be used for retirement purposes. Whereas when you use family assets, whether it's RSP funds or the taxpayer assets from the family residence, these are assets that are not locked in, right? So you're free to use these funds. And the uncertainty, if you become a limited member, both the limited member and the member would participate in the value of the pension based on the future salary increases until the limited member requests for payout or separate lifetime pension. So they would both equally share the future salary increases, like in terms of the impact and the value of the pension. Okay? But the uncertainty is higher, because when we do the compensation payment calculations, the valuation, we have a set of assumptions for future salary increases, right? The actual increases may be different, we don't know, but we are required by the actuarial standards. We need to include future salary increases that's equal to the general wage increase. There's no promotional, the merit scale included in our calculations. Okay. So the plan administer split, this higher uncertainty because we don't know what the future increases will be, right? For the member. The requirement is that when we present the marriage breakdown, the relationship breakdown, actuarial valuation results, you still need to reach an agreement or they go through the court and get a court order. We need agreement between the parties. But if they can't reach the agreement, the plan administer split is sort of the fallback option, the default option, right? Because they can't settle otherwise. So other key considerations is that there may be the desire on the part of the parties for immediate settlement, especially when the spouse is getting the residence, the family residence, right? The substantial value attached to that. And then the spouse need to give up significant value of other family assets, which will likely be the pension, right? So if they still have a residual claim through a plan administer split, there's not like sufficient value given up by the spouse in order to gain the property, the family residence, right? So they need to do a little bit of a trade-off here. And for compensation payment, I would say because the actuarial standards, we only need to include general wage increases, but the member will likely have a better idea what the future increases will be based on future promotion. So I would say that if the belief is that the member is going to be a fast tracker, advancing rapidly in terms of a career growth, like the pension plan member may be more willing to settle based on the my selected assumptions, the chosen assumptions as required by the actuarial standards, because we only need to include general wage increase. There's no merit promotional scale included. And often I would say the ages of the spouses would be the key determining factor. For example, if there's a large age gap between the two, you tend to not see the plan administer split. You tend to see more of a compensation payment as a settlement option. Because when you have a large age gap, let's assume the pension plan member is age 40, but the spouse is 20 years older, right? So realistically, the spouse or the limited member wouldn't want to wait another 15 years until the member reached age 55, because the member is age 40. You need to wait 15 years. But if the spouse is 20 years older, age 60, you wait for 15 years. You're age 75, right? Before you can access the commuted value or the separate lifetime pension, which may not be desirable from the spouse's perspective. And it depends on whether one of the parties is actively employed versus already retired. If the party is already retired, is drawing on a pension, then there's still the problem of if the elected form was joint survivor form of pension at pension commencement, it adds a layer of complexity, right? Because the right to a contingent survivor benefit has a value, but it's contingent on the pensioner predeceasing the spouse, which may or may not be realized. So there are other considerations too. There's high uncertainty. If the spouse is planning on taking a separate lifetime pension, likely the uncertainty is not as much. There's less volatility. But the pension commuted value, just because the discount rates are established based on the government bond yield, is very volatile. Like if we look at, for example, pension commuted value that was calculated a couple years ago to 2.5 years ago, gets the bottom of the interest rate cycle based on the discount rates was September, August, September of 2020. Okay, so the pension commuted value, just because of the increase in interest rates over the last couple years, would have resulted in a significant decline in the pension commuted value. But because you convert to a separate lifetime pension on the same basis, so the interest rate fluctuation would not impact the lifetime pension amount as much as compared to the lump sum value. And if the member is not yet age 55, there's a long wait to get the commuted value, right? So, which may make a big difference with changes in the discount rate for pension commuted value calculation purposes. Sometimes what would factor into the consideration is that the individual's investment knowledge and the perception of risk. Because, for example, most people say, I don't know anything about investment. Either they engage professionals like the financial planners to help them with it. They say, oh, I don't know anything about that. I'm more comfortable taking a lifetime pension from the pension plan. Right? So that may have a little bit of a bias towards the limited member or the spouse electing a lifetime pension rather than a lump sum. As I mentioned, the member may have a better idea what the pension plan member's future salary increases will be or promotions, and they will, if they know that they're going to have a major promotion or a significant salary increase soon, they may opt for, they're more willing to settle on a compensation payment because it doesn't take into account their promotional skills. There's some health issues, but for pension commuted value, it may not be information that the plan administrator is aware of, but they're also required by pension legislation to assume that they don't have the knowledge, so they would assume normal life expectancy, right, for purpose of the calculation. So I would say that there's incentive on the parties to go for a pension commuted value if they know that the pension plan member has some medical condition or impaired mortality, shortened life expectancy, because at least what the spouse can get out of the deal is if they are entitled to such an option, would be calculated based on normal life expectancy. Right, so that's some way that possibly the parties can make the settlement a bit more optimized in terms of value. Because if the limited member or the spouse would apply for the pension commuted value, it is calculated based on normal life expectancy. There's more, it's easier to do a trade-off when you have both spouses with pension, right? Because pension is also quite valuable. So if one party has accrued significant pension and the other one has not, the compensation payment can be quite significant. And the question is whether the parties would have sufficient other family properties to facilitate a compensation payment. So we just giving like some examples here. You may have both spouses with pension and they more or less have the same salary profile, similar years of service credit accrued during the cohabitation period. In that case, the values are very similar and it's easy to make a settlement on a compensation payment basis, because you just need to address the value difference between the two, right? And whereas if you look at case study number 2, one is having a significant number of years of service at a reasonable salary, and you don't have sufficient share of other assets, of other family assets to facilitate the compensation payment. So then it's less likely that it will be settled through compensation payment. It's more likely to have this settled through a plan administered split, because there's just not sufficient other family assets available to facilitate the compensation payment. There's some fee consideration too. Even if you do the plan administered split, you have to pay the administrator something. So rather than having 2 plan administered split, you may have a valuation to address the value difference, for example. We do offer for the plan administrator usually would not provide estimates of these amounts, like what amounts are we dealing with. So quite often we would be engaged to provide such an estimate. We do get the assumptions that the administrators use to do such calculation, and we can provide estimates. So the full report for compensation payment purposes, the full report is often the more expensive option, because we're required by the court standards and the actuarial standards to present results in a certain way. And that would involve a lot of the report writing, include like all the required components. But we do offer a summary report. We don't consider that as an expert report for litigation or court purposes, but we consider consulting advice if we get jointly engaged by parties to work out a solution or settlement. And that usually we would just provide a 1-page summary with the results, and then I would get on a telephone or get on a virtual meeting, Zoom meeting, a Teams meeting to present the results and answer any of the questions the parties may have. Okay, so that's usually the more cost-effective solution. Instead of the fee of $1,350, the cost is $825. And the parties can do this in a 2-stage sort of process. They can go with the 1 page because we do the same work. We just don't spend the extra time transcribing a lot of these from the worksheets and include a lot of the required components required by the court standards and our actuarial standards. So there's substantial savings there. So they can start with the summary, verbal report, telephone report, and expand to a full written report for court purposes if things don't work out. So they can certainly do that. But of course, they need to keep the same valuation date, because if they change the valuation date, the applicable assumptions like discount rates, inflation assumptions, they're all different. I cannot use the same result, right? They can pay me the cost differential by keeping the same valuation date. So all I need to do is just transcribe the results and add all the needed components in a written report. So this is sort of the one-page summary that we would provide for the compensation payment valuation results. Usually the 35-year maximum pensionable service is not that common. So this report only shows the 3 scenarios: immediate termination, continue working, and retire as of the earliest reduced age. In this case here, we assume age 60, and then normal retirement age 65. So this kind of pattern is quite common, because when you terminate, you don't benefit from the future salary increases. You may benefit from the cost of living adjustment under the plan, but the cost of living is usually based on price inflation, which generally is less than wage inflation. That's why the continuing employment scenario would give a higher value. Okay. And age 65 is lower value because a lot of the public sector plan, there's a bridging benefit. If you retire age 65, there's no bridging. Okay, so sometimes that tend to give you a low value. You see the average tax rate we used to convert to from pre-tax to post-tax. The rate for age 65 is higher. That's because our tax, we're assuming that the member would keep full pension by offering a compensation payment to the non-member spouse. But our income tax structure is progressive. The more income you have, the higher taxes you pay. By working for the extra 5 years between age 60 and age 65, the additional pension income would push the member to a higher tax bracket on average. Right. That's why you quite often you see a higher tax rate if we assume a later retirement age.
Stephen,
yes.
Sorry, I was going to ask a question about your previous slide as well, about the services and so on.
Yeah.
And the one question I had is, and again, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this one, which possibly could be, when someone has a pension and they're relatively new to the pension, such as, in the late 30s, early 40s, there's still an ability for them to reacquire pension credits by the time they retire, so that the person who has had to relinquish a portion of their pension can actually retain that again and have a full pension. Are you able to calculate how that's possible or explain it to clients?
Are you referring to the passers buyback that they can do in terms of a leave of absence or some of the previous service not yet covered by the pension plan?
Well, okay, so, and this is the only example I really have. So I had a friend of mine who is a firefighter here in Ontario, and when he split about 10 years ago, he approached his pension administrator and said, listen, what can I do? Like, I'm giving off $100,000 of my pension to my ex. And they were able to walk through with him and say, listen, even if you give this $100,000, here's the impact of your monthly benefit come the time you retire. versus if you don't give her anything, what the changes would be. And it ended up only being like $270 a month, which was kind of I was kind of shocked at that. But then they also mentioned to him that as he goes through his years of service, he has the ability to sit there and buy back those pension credits, in essence, that he had relinquished to his ex for that $100,000, so that he could end up having a full pension again in the future. And I didn't know if that was the case or if that's something they can do or can't do. So
Okay.
he's a firefighter, so I don't know.
Yeah, the funding room comes from different sources, right? Because in the Ontario, when you pay a lump sum, I guess in the IPP example, that it's very similar.
Okay.
Because this is the final average salary, right? Because going forward, you have salary increases, whereas whatever the plan paid the spouse, it's a fixed amount and depends on the plan's administration practices. Some plans would accrue the payout amount with future return and convert to an equivalent reduction at age 65 or at actual retirement. So they may be presented with future opportunities for the pension plan member to pick up some of the room sort of created by the future salary increases. Yeah, it's possible.
So is that possible with all defined benefit plans or just specific ones?
There's specific ones. I think there's more opportunities for termination methods, the jurisdiction like Ontario. For BC is a bit more complex and difficult because in the BC model, the future salary escalation is embedded in the calculation.
Well, that's what I saw. So that's why I was asking the question, because again, I have, a couple of cases right now where, parties are worried about if I don't want, the typical, I don't want them having a portion of my pension. And then the question is, okay, well, why don't you ask your pension administrator what the impact would be if you decided to do it right now and you're like 38 years old? What is the impact on that final monthly benefit if you did it now? And are there opportunities to sit there and reoccur that shortfall?
Yeah.
Do you, if we hired someone like yourself, are you able to do that? Or is that only something the pension administrators would be able to do? It's
the pension plan administrator, because we don't get into the very specific administration policies and details like the plan administrator. Yeah. Okay. Because often we relied on information from them, but we do work with certain plans often enough that we know, like, for example, if you're dealing with Air Canada, they publish like the detailed plan administration policy that they have. They say this is how they administer. So we say, this is assigned, paid out, and that would accumulate with interest at a certain way. So we can do estimates and projections on the information based on the detailed administration policies that they provide us, right? As to what's the effect on the piece that was paid out to the former spouse, and whether there's room that they can exercise certain buyback of service. Okay. Good. Thank you. You're welcome. So we would show both the summary here, the pre-tax and the post-tax amount. Of course, we may not have an agreement between the parties as to what values or what scenario they should pick, right? They can certainly work out a settlement based on these numbers. Maybe there's no agreement on an assumed retirement age, but if they feel that the proper assumed retirement age is 62 and a half, they can take the average of the 60 and the 65 numbers, right, for settlement discussion purposes. But we would try to help them in terms of facilitating a settlement. We just providing information and numbers to help the parties, right? Or even if we need to submit a report to court, we would answer to the court if whatever questions they ask us. Yeah, and sometimes the parties may request me to do an extra calculation, say, we agree to assume age 61 and a half. So then I would just do an extra set of special calculations. We would charge a little bit more fee, but the parties can, if they jointly retain me for the purposes of the pension valuation, I can help them with whatever they request from me as the additional scenarios for their consideration. There's some Ontario rules, but I can tell you that Ontario rules are very complex. I just like to give you a flavor as to the logic, the rationale behind certain things that they do, so that that will enhance a little bit of your understanding of the family, Ontario family law value. Okay. So it's in the legislation, and of course they have different forms, and for different purposes. There's a defined contribution type of benefit, and you have active plan member that may be combined defined benefit, defined contribution. You may be dealing with a retired member. So there are different forms that they use for that. And of course, the form 5 that will come later. You apply to transfer the family law value, or to apply to divide a retired member's pension. Unfortunately, this session here is it's a very comprehensive subject, and we just need to cover some of the major points here. Form 7 is just to notify the plan administrator you're not doing a division of the family law value or the family pension assets. You're doing it outside of the plan. Of course, they have different value. They provide what we call preliminary value, PV, which is the total. And then the family law value is just the pro rata portion of the preliminary value that relates to the period of spousal relationship. And then there's a maximum 50% share that they will pay out to the spouse. Note that there is also subject to the plan's transfer ratio, because if the plan is not fully funded on a solvency basis or plan termination basis, there are restrictions as to how much can be transferred out to a member or former spouse. And for example, if the plan solvency ratio is only 80%, you will be only be able to transfer 80% of the family law value. It's complex because they look at the pension commuted value calculated as of the family law valuation date, what they call FLVD. And then there's B, it's the same as A, which is assuming termination as of the family law valuation date. But then you assume A is assuming that, like I already mentioned, that even the commuted value is like looking at all the possible retirement ages and pick the one with the highest, and then you take the average. But here it's spelled out in the regulation how it's calculated. So B is the same calculation, except that you assume pension commencement at the normal retirement date. C is the same, but you assume the earliest and reduced retirement dates, assuming continuing employment. Okay, so it's a combination of ABC. So this adds to the complexity, but I'll just go through with you here. And then there's the time T, which is from the family law valuation date to the earliest and reduced date, assuming continuing employment. You see the complexity is like, there's a lot of formulas. You may be getting off confused, but if you look at what it will make sense is that if you look at the time from the family law valuation date to the earliest unreduced date, they define it in every 10-year interval. Like T is less than 10 years, you use a certain formula. 10 is between 10 and 20, you use a different formula. Between 20, 30 or over 30, these are 4 different formulas. So I'll see on the next slide here, is showing at the break point here, the combination A, B, and C. If T is 0, there's no A, there's only B and C, right? Because you're very close to your retirement dates. Like your time horizon from the family law valuation date is short, is 0 or less than 10 years. Then there's more weighting towards the retirement dates, the future, right? Whereas A is immediate termination, right? You have more weighting. If you notice, like T is greater than 30 years. You're more than 30 years away from your earliest unreduced date. So they attach 85% weight to immediate termination and much less for retirement at unreduced date or the normal retirement dates. So they're saying you're 30 years away from retirement. So the likelihood of the member remaining in the plan and work till retirement is not much. We rather attach a higher weighting to A, right? So so if you look at the rationale behind the way that the legislator and the regulator set up these formulas, so it's a matter of weighting all the three pieces here. And then it depends on whether the member has reached the earliest the early retirement dates. And then we have different formula applied. It takes into certain weighting, that's the time elapsed between the unreduced date to the normal retirement dates, and also the time from the family law valuation dates to the normal retirement dates. So it's some weighted average that we would take into the consideration here. Okay. I guess we'll move on to the individual pension plan. And for individual pension plan, the big change that happened recently was back in late 2020. On December 8th, Ontario passed a legislation to allow exemption of individual pension plans from registration with the Financial Services Regulatory Authority. What we refer to as FSA used to be what we refer to as the the Pension Commission of Ontario. So now with the exemption, it's not required to register the plan with FSA, and it's not subject to the pension legislation. So there's no statutory funding requirements that would be applicable to the plan. This means also that a lot of the IPPs, because of the provincial exemption, now they're not as well funded because there's no mandatory requirement for the employer to make the statutory minimum contributions, right? So these IPP assets quite often would not be sufficient to meet the future payout. So that's why you tend to see a lot of the IPPs in terms of settlement would be based on the plan assets accumulated during the relationship period, rather than like, for example, the public sector plan, we would value it as a present value of the future annuity payments, the future pension payments. We don't usually do that for an IPP because these plans are not properly funded, and even if they are funded, there's a lot of funding restriction attached by the required by the income tax regulations. Like, for example, for the actuary doing the valuation, the actuary must assume a 7.5% per annum discount rate. So when we use such high discount rate, the plan are not well funded. Like, it's not like I can work with the employer or the plan sponsor to use a lower discount rate for valuation purposes. I don't have that luxury. I must use the income tax regulation mandated 7.5% per annum discount rate, right? So that's why for most IPPs, like I worked on 1,000 IPPs, and if there's a marriage breakdown, I would say over 95% of the cases, the parties would be just happy to look at, yeah, it's fair that the spouse to get half of the planned assets accumulated through during the relationship period, and we just take half of that amount and transfer to the spouse's locked-in retirement account. That's usually what happens with a pension split of IPP assets. So as an example, we use this as an example here. As at the dates of separation, the IPP had assets of $250,000, and out of the $250,000, 100,000 were attributable to pre-cohabitation contributions with interest. 150,000 was attributable to the cohabitation period contribution plus interest. So now the spouse's share, based on the rationale that we just mentioned, would be half of the 150,000 accumulated during the cohab period. So taking half of that is 75 grand. Like, but it's not necessarily you'll be able to settle right at the separation date. Like even when we get notified by our client and say, oh, we have an IPP, but we separated a year ago. Then we look at the history of the contribution and say, oh, okay, we need to accumulate what was accrued during the relationship period with interest to the settlement date, right? So we assume the 75,000, the spouse's share would have grown to 80,000 from the separation date to the settlement date. And we would, as of the settlement date, transfer the updated amount, the 80,000, to the spouse's locked-in retirement account. And we say, and at the same time as the administrator of the IPP, we say, okay, we need to identify how much the pension at age 65 is reduced by. We don't know when the IPP member is going to retire, but we need to identify something, right? We need to identify that, say, based on the pension commuted value actuarial standards, how much of the lump sum of 80,000 would be equivalent to a lifetime pension for the member, for the IPP member. So I'm just using as an example here, say the equivalent reduction is $10,000 of annual pension at age 65, which is defined as a normal retirement age. So in the future, at the actual retirement dates, we would look at the pensionable salary history, the pensionable service history, what's the total pension? And now as a result of the transfer out for the spouse, we should have reduced it by 10,000. So in this example here, based on the salary and income and service history, we determined that the total pension would have been 75,000 at age 65. Now we, with the payout, we should have reduced that by 10,000. So we subtracted the 10,000, and then we say, well, the member should be entitled to 65,000. But of course, the member may not be retiring at exactly age 65, the normal retirement age. Then we do the necessary early retirement reduction factor if it's prior to age 65 to the $65,000 annual pension amount, or we may be providing an increase factor if the IPP member postpone commencement of pension beyond age 65.
Hey, Stephen.
Yes.
IPP would an RCA be an IPP?
No, RCA is not a registered plan.
Oh, right.
RCA
Okay.
is funding for supplemental pension, which is because registered pension plan can only cover up to the defined benefit limit, right? Which is currently about $3,600 of annual pension for each year of service. So RCA can fund for a supplemental pension, but the registered pension plan covers up to the registered limit. And so RCA is covering the supplemental piece, which is not part of a registered plan. So RCA is what we call a non-registered plan. And that's why if you set up a trust fund, you need to send half the money to CRA in the form of refundable tax, right? Because they're saying that RCA should not get a tax advantage like a registered plan. So they designed a 50% refundable tax to take away your investable RCA dollars, right? So they're saying if you don't have an RCA, you pay the executive. They pay on average 50%, because when they introduced the RCA rules, all the provinces had top marginal rate at about 50%. To say, well, let's take away 50% investable assets, so they're now in equal footing with non-registered savings for the executive. Right? Okay, so
just a sec. We have a question from Salim regarding the previous slide. So I'll read it exactly. Should the reduction not be 75 divided by 80 for 10,000, which equals 9,375, as the additional 5,000 was interest adjustment on the 75 CD due to the payment at a later date?
No, because we're looking at assets, right? We just 80,000 was transferred, right? So from a pension commuted value calculation perspective, we say by the plan paying out 80,000 to the former spouse, how much do we reduce the member's pension? And that's calculated as of the settlement date, not the separation date, because that was the dates that we pay out so much to the spouse. Right.
Great, thanks.
Okay. So I work mostly on BC plans, and quite often I do Alberta reports, but we do work on a lot of the what we call federally registered plans. The industries that are regulated federally, like banking, airlines, interprovincial trucking, and so forth. So I list some examples here. So I do a lot of work on the bank-owned, the charter banks, pension plans, Air Canada, Canada Post, CNCP kind of pension plan. Okay. So there's actuaries, because the actuaries tend to specialize in the where they practice. Of course, some of us, we do work across the country, but we're not as competitive, because if we do a case in Ontario, if we need to testify, I may need to travel to Ontario, or I may be able to testify remotely via video link. But people tend to use actuaries that are local, and there's I provided this link here. If you click on this link, it would take you to the, can you see the screen? No? Okay, I need to maybe share.
Oh, sorry, I had mute on. There we go. Now we can see it.
Oh, now you can see. Okay. Yeah. This is the Canadian Institute of Actuaries website. So there's a finance actuary sort of link here. So if you click on hire an actuary, and then there's some specialty, whether it's civil litigation, marriage breakdown. So let's say marriage breakdown. If you select Western Canada, then you've got your language, let's say English, search, accept. Of course, you have to select the I accept, and you do the search. you see my name is one of the names showing here, right? Of course, there are other actuaries that are providing the similar services. So if you click Ontario, then you see a list of different providers. Okay, so you can go through the website tool and find a provider.
That's great. I appreciate you leaving that in there.
Great. All right, so if I go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, can you see the slide or do I have to reshare?
No, you have to reshare.
Okay, so I stop sharing here.
Yeah, there we go.
And I go new share, going back to here.
Yep.
Okay, sorry.
No, it's all good. So we're pretty close to wrapping up. So if anybody has any last minute questions,
Right.
please feel free.
Okay, just the recent developments. The Canadian Institute of Actuaries, we changed the commuted value standards. That was revised in late 2020. And we have new separate standards for target benefit plans, because for target benefit plans, the benefits are not guaranteed like a traditional defined benefit plan. So we introduced new separate standards for that. And then back in late 2020 and early 2021, interest rate got so low. So we introduced some standards to account for the possibility of negative interest rates. Actually, the actuarial standards for actuarial evidence, which is part 4,000 of our standards, got revised recently, effective January 1st, 2023. The capitalized value of pension plan benefits on a relationship breakdown was also revised. The major changes include the change in the discount rate for after the first 20 years for non-index. Like in a previous example, you would have noticed 4.75% after the first 20 years. And before the recent change, with the standard call for 5.5%. So most of these changes were just reflecting current environment in terms of interest rate and so forth. Inflation rate, the previous standards call for 2.25%, and now it's been reduced to 2%. Of course, like lately, inflation has been running pretty high, but Bank of Canada, based on their remarks about their inflation control target, they're still comfortable with the 2% as their inflation control target. The wage increase prior to the recent change, the wage was assumed to be 1% per annum over inflation, but now it's been reduced to 0.75%. Okay, so these are the recent changes to the marriage breakdown standard. So I would say the change in the discount rate, now that because the rates are lower, inflation are lower, depends on how they interact, it may result in a higher value or lower value as compared to the previous standard. But these are what we call for in the new standards. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation, and thank you all. And perhaps we can we still have time for some questions.
Yeah, if there's any last questions, feel free to jump in. I don't know. So far, I'm seeing everybody saying thank you. And I would also really like to thank you very much. I think you've definitely done a great job at giving us a lot of information about the different kinds of pensions, and certainly helping understand that how complicated it really is.
You're welcome. Yeah, it's a complex world. So if you have any question, let me know. Send me a quick email. I'll be happy to answer those. And if there are other topics that may interest your group, like we had an RCA question, or
Yeah.
it may be worthwhile for us to have a separate session, maybe a refresher of
Sure.
the pension, and also some additional contents concerning supplemental pension, RCA.
Yeah, I think that definitely something we might want to pursue further.
Great.
So thanks so much
do
for your
have two quick questions, if
go
possible.
ahead, Jerusha. Yeah.
Thank you. So I have a client that is a federal employee.
Mhm.
And it's been like 10 months and they haven't been able to get a pension letter from the federal government. Is that pretty normal?
Yeah, right now, I guess the
With the
short on,
Phoenix system, she says that.
resources. Yeah, I noticed that in my work as well. Bear in mind that unlike what we call the federally registered pension plans, which is like regulated by OSFI, some of the federal workers pension plans, the superannuation, they are governed by a federal statute. And that would include like the RCMP superannuation, the federal public service superannuation. They don't handle the like similar to these Ontario or federally registered plans. They have a special statute that's called Pension Division Act, Pension Benefits Division Act, PBDA. So they have a prescribed calculation methodology based on that statute. So they're not subject to the commuted value standards. Of course, the calculation of the PBDA amount is similar to a commuted value calculation, but it's subject to a different federal statute.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So, but it takes a long time to get an estimate of the PBDA amount, which like the spouse can transfer to a locked-in RSP. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Is that both
Okay.
your questions, Jerusha?
Well, no, my other one was actually just on a general, when you have a client that is very reluctant to have an actuarial assessment done on their pension, what is their biggest risk? Like I've tried to explain to them, I have one client that has a pension worth about, based on their pension letter, about $370,000 right now. And they have about 18 years with the company. And he refuses to have an actuarial assessment done. He says the number that they gave him, as far as he's concerned, is good enough. So I was just curious to hear your explanation as to what their biggest risk is by not doing it. And maybe I can better explain it to my client.
Well, most of these people, they're seeing the estimate like provided by the plan administrator. They're comfortable because most of the time the people involved in the calculation are the sort of the in-house pension staff, and their consulting actuary would have helped them with setting up the system and doing these calculations. Like you see the very complicated formula.
They are, yeah.
Depending on the duration, you take this, that, and do a weighted average. I can certainly appreciate people feeling comfortable with what the actuarial firm or the in-house pension administrator have done in terms of the calculations. I would say it's maybe 95% of the time correct, but because it's so complex, there's the prospect of like if you have a third-party actuary reviewing it, maybe catching certain, because the calculations involve so many pieces and components, and there would be times that even the amount quoted by the plan administrator is not correct, right? But I would say it's not likely that most of the calculations are incorrect, but I would say it's fair to say that approximately maybe 2 or 3% or maximum 5% of the time, you may see a mistake by having a third party independent review.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
Okay.
Well, thanks very much. And again, if there's any other questions, you have Stephen's information that you can reach out to him directly. Those of
Okay.
you that are in BC certainly have a great resource available.
Okay, and I will send the PDF for the slides to Linda for distribution.
Perfect.
Okay, great.
Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you
Great.
all. Thanks
Bye.
everyone. Bye for now.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Have a good day.